So, you know, that about that time, it in that period leading up to that, Paul and Paul was, you know, he was busy running around doing other things, but I'd see him every now and then and talk to him frequently. We came to the great conclusion that spiral eddies were everywhere, that they simply were not confined to certain areas of the ocean where there were strong currents or where they were spun off from the shoreline, but they were everywhere. And the reason we didn't see them everywhere was that there were not enough organic oils, surfactants, these monomolecular oils on the sea surface, to permit the streamlines to be reflected back by the sunlight into the camera or into the crew's eyes. And so I began to train or try to get the crews to look for spiral eddies in areas where in no way would we ever expect to see them. There were no major ocean currents, there were no bumps in the bottom of the ocean, there was no shoreline, no anything. You know, out here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, away from everything, there aren't any spiral eddies. But what is there? Well, they begin to see them. Isolated, maybe, and very difficult to see because there, as I say, there's not enough biological oils on the surface there. That's pretty biologically barren in a lot of the seas, but nonetheless, we began to see them. And it became very clear that they're everywhere. They're ephemeral. We began to see areas where there'd be spiral eddies, and then the shuttle would come back on that orbit 2 or 3 days later, whatever their orbit was, and there'd be spiral eddies there, but not the same spiral eddies. You could never see the same ones. And so that meant the field was still there, but these things were moving and changing. You know, like smoke from a cigarette. You can't follow any puff as you blow it in the air, or pipe or whatever it is, or any kind of motion like that. You can't continuously follow that for very long because they keep changing. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not dynamic. They're still there. There are still eddies there. And you see, we then learned that they go down to 100 to 200 or 300 meters. They're rotating. They're rotating at good speeds. They're only rotating cyclonically. That is, they go counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere. And there have been many oceanographers say that can't happen. But, you know, nobody's ever been able to explain why that does happen. I know this one guy was giving a talk somewhere, and is a guy I'd known for years and years and years, and a physical oceanographer from England. And he says, Bob, he said, that's against the law of conservation of vorticity. I said, who the hell ever made that law, you know? He said, I did. It can't happen. I said, yeah, but it does, you know. And he, So it became, we became convinced that they were indeed everywhere, and the forces that were creating them, therefore, had to be everywhere. It wasn't just here along that current boundary or that shoreline, but there had to be something else. And so we finally began to realize there had been a lot of Russian research also on these subsurface eddies of a little larger scale, but nonetheless subsurface eddies. And so then we decided then it had to be that at the thermocline, where the sea surface, where the sea temperature in the upper layer it's so well mixed by waves that the temperature's the same going down to a given depth. And then finally that surface turbulence disappears. Can't go any deeper. And so then the temperature begins to decline. And so there's kind of there's a surface there where this density of the water is less than this density down here. And that's called the thermocline, or the place where the temperature gradient changes. And people have known that for years, and this surface layer was where all the navies like to have an acoustic channel, see, and so when nuclear submarines came along and they could go below that, well, that was a big, oh, God, horrible. So anyway, the thing then, we begin to feel what's going on here is that subsurface layer is probably not flat, and it may have, because there are these eddies the Soviets had found down below the surface, and so they're going to be rotating, and they're either going to make, they rotate one way, the water's going to go down, and the other way it's going to go up, and so that subsurface layer is probably like a bunch of hills and valleys. And so on top of the hill, the water subsurface is going to flow off the top of the hill, and in the northern hemisphere it's going to turn, because of Coriolis, it's going to turn to the right, and if you got a valley, then that water is going to flood down the valley, and so what you're going to have is those subsurface hills and valleys creating a motion in the upper layer, which is going to spin into eddies.